Welcome to Chapter 3 of Dividing Lines. This is 27th Street. Before there was Troost dividing white from black, rich from poor, there was the 27th Street Wall. Up until the 50s, this was the southernmost limit that black families were allowed to live. The neighborhoods to your left were white only, using racially restrictive covenants and intimidation tactics to keep, quote, undesirable associations from moving in. During the 50s, the 27th Street Wall finally broke, and within 20 years, the demographic makeup had changed entirely. A burgeoning population of black families moving up from the south had been crammed into the Vine Street corridor, a place we'll visit in about 15 minutes. When the 27th Street line was broken, black families moved out quickly because for so long, they'd been crammed 2, 4, even 6 families to a unit. Lack of indoor plumbing and electricity had families eager for something different. But then, when they moved out, they were often taken advantage of. They were sold properties at inflated prices and with astronomical interest rates. Oftentimes, this caused the new black homeowners to default on their mortgages within a year's time, thus reaffirming banks in their refusal to give quality mortgages to black buyers.
And so if you couldn't get a traditional mortgage in there, how did you buy a house? How did houses change hands? And it was a combination of government Section 235 subsidies. It was speculators like Harold Klopper and James Northern, whom we finally drove out of business. And it was cash deals where the owner would take a second mortgage back just to sell the house. And it was property that got foreclosed on because the owners couldn't stay with it and lost their homes. It was a whole series of things. So that's what we wrote about.
Here's Sid Willens again. He's picking up from when he had asked Harold Klopper, his trusted friend, if he could actually see one of the homes in the involved parties.
Harold called me, he says, you want to hear? Come on to the house and you'll see, you're going to walk in. I walk into the house with Harold Klopper, and when I walk in, there's a woman, a black woman, and she's there with a social worker, and the roof is leaking. And they're with a big bucket there, and she's there, and the social worker's trying to tell her how to be a homeowner. And I said, what's going on here? So I get back to my office, and I thought, well, I'm going to call a lawyer that was in the Charno office who went and worked for the FHA, and Jess Levine. And I said, Jess, what the hell's going on here? How in the hell are you going to tell somebody that you're going to insure a house for 30 years that's 50 years old and the roof is leaking, and you expect people, black, white, polka dot, or anybody to... And he says, let me check and I'll call you back. He says, we didn't have never forget, we did not have enough budget for ladders, so they couldn't go and see the roof.
When Sid told me this, he seemed near tears. He wanted you to hear this story, the absurdity and the cruelty of it. Harold Klopper had been making himself and Sid, the investor, loads of money by buying dilapidated homes for cheap from scared white owners and selling them at a premium to eager black buyers, and all while taking advantage, quite legally, of government subsidies. Put plainly, Sid had been bankrolling, blockbusting on the east side of Troost. In 1968, the Federal Housing Administration was forced to admit that their policies had unjust impact on African Americans. They had been historically kept out of the best neighborhoods and hadn't been able to take advantage of subsidized mortgages during the suburban boom because of racially restrictive covenants. The FHA's apology was the Section 235 program, a federal subsidy built to supposedly help black homebuyers. But as Sid found, the program was underfunded and understaffed, resulting in little to no oversight. Realtors continued to take advantage of black families, funneling them into houses east of Troost, now with the government footing much of the bill. Sid was spurred into action. He talked to brokers and real estate agents, and he got an idea. He decided he would organize people in his neighborhood to resist the turnover of homes and to resist white flight.
And so I said, I'm going to start the business of Marlboro Heights.
That's the neighborhood Sid lived in. All the while, he was learning more and more about the Section 235 program and how broken it was.
This is insane. This is what the government's going to do. So I started, no Google back then, and I started studying it, and I ended up saying, I've got to talk to the real estate company, the organization. I ended up calling Dick Bowling, who I helped with my partner George Charno get into Congress in 1948. He got elected. Fast forward from 48, now we're in the 60s. I call and I just get me into George Romney. That's the father of Mitt. Now Mitt is the son. And he said, what do you want? I said, I want to meet with him. So Dick calls me back. He says, you can't see Romney, but you can see a man, and I think his name was Charles Silberman, I'm not sure. He says, you want to go? Yes, I'm paying my own expense. We fly to New York at our expense and walk into the HUD building, and Mr. Silverman greets us. And he ends up saying, come into this room, and we walk in, the most ornate room in the HUD building. So they're sitting there, and I get up with my charts, and I just tell them the story. And the story is something's got to be done, and we've just got to do it. And they shook their heads, and nobody said, they didn't ask a question. And just as they were going out, Mr. and Mrs. Willens, would you mind sitting here, waiting here? I'd like to visit with you alone. Never forget this. And they all go out, and this board, nobody else is. Mr. Silverman moves his chair over next to him. He says, the reason this is not going to happen is because President Johnson told Mr. Romney, get those colored folks in houses, because that's when the riots started in '68. And I said, what? He says, yes, it besides the administrative work it would take.
To recap, Sidney Willens, a Kansas City attorney who up until this point had helped finance racial turnover, had amended his ways. He had become a civil rights lawyer, and he wasn't afraid to go straight to the top when he noticed government programs subsidizing the movement of black citizens into substandard housing. But when he met with a man in charge, he got the slip. Mr. Silberman, telling Sid that the 235 program was intended to silence and appease people who were organized and demanding justice, and that anyhow, it'd be too much work to change. We're going to the part of the city that isn't neglected. A part of the city that didn't get the short end of the federal regulation stick, and which continues to receive all sorts of municipal, state, and federal subsidies. Kansas City, like so many cities, saw a hollowing out during the latter half of the 20th century. Those who had enough money and the right skin color moved to the suburbs, seeking the bill of goods the American dream sold them: homeownership, a big yard, refrigerators, and the automobile. With the middle-income folk went their money, and the city saw decay as its budget saw growing deficits from lack of property tax and sales tax. As we drive through the crossroads, however, you don't see that decay. You see trendy, award-winning restaurants, co-working spaces, new construction, and the streetcar line we're driving over. Millions of dollars of tax increment financing and bond issues have been levied to create what you see around you. That same type of economic risk-taking, however, never crossed into the black, poorer side of town.
It was felt strongly that Kansas City was a very segregated city, and this road was dividing and separating that already separated city.
Here's Mamie Hughes again, talking about Bruce R. Watkins Drive, or Highway 71. The highway was envisioned as part of an answer to the issue of the city center hollowing out, as a way for the mostly white suburbanites to easily get downtown. A highway right through the neighborhoods on the east side of Troost.
Those concerned people brought a lawsuit in the United States District Court in 1973, and the court case lasted with meetings and the city hiring a contractor, Howard Needles, Tamman and Bergendorf, to prepare a plan. There had been 41 stipulations at the settlement of the lawsuit, and one of those was that the city would hire an ombudsman. The job was advertised. 5 of us replied, and I was chosen as the ombudsman.
As ombudsman, Mamie's job was to liaise between the residents of the neighborhoods along the proposed roadway route and the commissions in charge of planning and construction. Just to your left, you're seeing the result of some of the city's most lavish investment. The Power and Light District, the T-Mobile Center. This is where the party is at. Luxury condominiums abound here. Power and Light cost around $350 million to build from 2003 to 2005. It was controversial at the time, with strong feelings, strong arguments on both sides, but those in favor of the district won out. Another of Mamie's tasks for the Bruce R. Watkins Drive project was to keep the people abreast of their rights as the city acquired their properties. Mamie helped people to find a litigator in the case that the amount they were offered for their properties was insufficient. She worked and worked to help as many residents as possible, but she was only one person, and she came late in the long, long story.
I started work in 1986, continued until the completion of the roadway, which was 2001. I was known to say to people that was probably the oldest road in Missouri, since the first planning of it started in 1951, and here we were at the completion in 2001.
The highway project was completed in October 2001. During the 50 years it took to build the highway, more than 10,000 people were relocated. The people displaced received an average of $15,000 for their property and $3,500 in relocation costs.
All of the area that you see, Bruce R. Watkins now, those were places where they were actually homes, people living in those areas.
This is Margaret May, a local neighborhood leader.
And the thing that was so negative about it is they had planned to build the road in the late 1960s, so they started acquiring properties. So with them not building it until the 90s, you can imagine that where Bruce R. Watkins Drive is now, that was vacant land for all of those years until they started building the roadway. So that became a hangout place for people wanting to do negative things. Really, really bad, if you can imagine. All of that expanse where people were just hanging out or dumping trash or doing things like that. So it wasn't a good thing.
And I'd like to add that it wouldn't have been a good thing in any neighborhood of any demographic makeup. Vacant buildings are a haven for the desperate, those rejected by legitimate means of getting by or making money of any race. Look to your left. This is Kansas City's famed historic jazz district. 18th and Vine developed as a black settlement area in the 1880s and 1890s. By 1907, white real estate brokers would basically only sell or rent to blacks in the immediate area, but not south of 27th Street. The area became the commercial and cultural center for black Kansas City residents. And during the machine politics era of boss Tom Pendergast, there was a perception that all the city's illicit industries, drugs, booze, prostitution, were corralled by the white power holders onto the strip where you're driving today, thus creating and reinforcing stereotypes of black moral inferiority, but it was all a ruse. The area produced many notable jazz musicians in the 1930s and 1940s, and while the district had received more than $30 million of investment since the 1980s, that's less than $1 million a year. Meanwhile, the city spent an extra $14 million on the Power and Light District in 2013 alone, and that wasn't an abnormal year. But whether $30 million is a lot or a little, it hasn't brought the area back to its former glory. A lot of the buildings that once stood here are long gone. Here's Mimi Hughes reflecting on 18th and Vine at its zenith.
Sometimes Uncle George would take us in his car, and we would simply go on a Friday night or a Saturday night and watch all of the activity. There were the restaurants, there were the different businesses, shoe repair, clothing stores, the Lincoln Building on the southeast corner of 18th and Vine. The Lincoln Building housed professional offices, lawyers, doctors, and so forth. And on the street level were some of those shops. 'Cause your fee's too big.
John inquired, "Twas Sweetwater. How's that for a vocal? Ain't it a killer? Where'd you get 'em? Your gal, she loves you. She thinks you're nice. She claims you got everything to take you to paradise. Ain't that a killer?"
Things changed for 18th and Vine. Blockbusting and redlining disinvested the area. That vacant lot to your right is evidence of an old KC that no longer exists. It used to be Municipal Stadium, where the Royals Major League Baseball team would have played. But back then they were called the Athletics. Opened in 1923, the stadium hosted the minor league Kansas City Blues and the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro Leagues. The stadium was renovated prior to the 1955 baseball season and hosted the Kansas City Athletics from 55 to 67, the Kansas City Royals from 69 to 72, and the Kansas City Chiefs from 63 to 71. But after the 1972 baseball season, the stadium was replaced with the Truman Sports Complex. Municipal Stadium was then demolished in 1976. Though public discussion was limited, the perception was that the predominantly white, middle-class fan bases were no longer comfortable with a stadium located in a now poor, black neighborhood. What is often forgotten is that athletic events at Municipal Stadium not only brought income to black-owned businesses around 18th and Vine, but it also brought supplementary income to homeowners who charged commuters to park in their driveways or yards during games. The movement of Municipal Stadium directly reduced the amount of money going to black families living in these neighborhoods. Up to your right is Lincoln Preparatory Academy, the crown jewel of Kansas City Public Schools. Lincoln Prep is one of the best-ranked schools in Missouri. It's a symptom of white reactions to school integration that excellent black schools are often overlooked. Margaret May, longtime Kansas Citian, explains.
We were all excited when integration came about because, we had been told that the schools that the white kids were going to were better than the schools that we had. They weren't. And what I realized as an adult looking back, before affirmative action, the teachers that we had in the grade schools or the high schools, these were people who had college degrees, who weren't able to get jobs in the fields that they were trained to be in. And so they taught school. And I distinctly remember over and over again teachers saying to me, you must learn to do this or that, and you must learn to do it really well, because times are changing and you're going to have opportunities that we won't have. And if they expect 100% of the white people, you're going to have to do 200%. Over and over again, that's actually what our teachers drilled into us.
But after school integration, many excellent black educators lost their jobs, while middling or low-performing white educators experienced promotions and enduring job security. Black students who began to attend previously white schools were often segregated inside the building or had white teachers who either expected less of them or were explicitly discriminatory. The net effect was that black students tended to go from schools where teachers knew them, understood them, and believed in them to schools where they faced daily discrimination. I used to think that Brown v. Board of Education was all good. It turns out it was a mixed bag at best. Integration never truly happened in a way that stuck. In fact, a 2013 report from the Economic Policy Institute showed that schools in 2013 were more segregated than they were in the 1970s. Earlier, we left Sid when he began his crusade to fight white flight. He tried to keep his white neighbors from falling prey to the machinations of tricky real estate profiteers. Sid stayed in Marlboro Heights a long time before he and his wife moved away. When they moved, they lost money on the house because, as property appraisals go, they were penalized by the system for living in a racially heterogeneous neighborhood. They knew, however, that living in a racially mixed neighborhood wasn't something that degraded the quality of a neighborhood, even though the real estate system, as constructed by both property appraisers and demand created by aspiring homeowners, continues to treat property values that way. We're in Ivanhoe now. New efforts here in Ivanhoe are fighting the deleterious future carved out for black neighborhoods. Here's Margaret May, former executive director of the Ivanhoe Community Center.
Initially, the people who moved into the neighborhood were working people. They took very good care of their homes, and so this really was a very thriving neighborhood in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. But as time passed, then as affirmative action came into place and African Americans could get all kinds of jobs rather than just being relegated to the lower paying jobs, then as people were making more money, then we had the middle class black people fly to the suburbs, just like we had the whites to go to the suburbs. And so that left behind people who were lower income, or unemployment hit in the 80s as well. And coincidentally, at the time all of this occurred, was a time when the manufacturing companies were starting to close. People that had been gainfully employed then, lost their jobs and what have you. And all of that led to the turmoil that we had in the 80s and 90s.
Margaret positions the crack epidemic as a result of black flight and deindustrialization and underemployment. The U.S. government, however, did not. To the U.S. government, it was a result of black criminality, and it had to be fought through the war on drugs. Decades later, the opioid epidemic largely affected underemployed rural white areas. And rather than being handled as a war to be won, this crisis was decried as an epidemic to treat. Where the government failed in providing social services that may have helped the residents of Ivanhoe out of poverty, the residents of Ivanhoe sought to help themselves. The neighborhood began to organize, starting with Alan and Yolanda Young in 1997.
Over the past years, since 2000, we've closed more than 700 drug houses. And I'm told that back in the late 1990s, there was literally a drug house on almost every block in this neighborhood. So I wish I could tell you we have no drug houses now, but what I can tell you, whenever one opens, the people that live on that block are busy calling us, working with the police so that we can get them closed.
It was Alan and Yolanda Young who first organized the neighborhood to work with the police to get rid of the drug houses. They started a movement, which still ripples positively to this day. We're headed to the Ivanhoe Neighborhood Center now.
I can't tell you how important it is for the people who live in an area to care and be willing to do the things that it takes to revitalize the neighborhood. So in 2000, the neighborhood worked on a strategic plan. And over a 6-month time period, they came up with a plan that included more than 100 items that covered beautification, crime and safety, housing, youth and family life kinds of issues. And we've been working on that plan over the years. We've made some revisions to it. We've added some things. We've completed some things. But we're very focused on actually fulfilling the things in that plan. And the mission of the Ivanhoe neighborhood is building a clean, beautiful, safe, and thriving neighborhood. So all the things that we do are just kind of within that mission.
Ivanhoe is a large neighborhood. Margaret told me that about 6,000 people live here. For me, it's a vestige of hope. For decades, Ivanhoe saw decay due to redlining, blockbusting, and the post-industrial era. Because of that, it became a dangerous and crime-fraught place to live. But now, this neighborhood is a community, and it's evidence that even though the force of history continues to perpetuate division and inequity, people working together can organize to create change. I want to finish with something Lauren Cole said. You heard from her a lifetime ago at the beginning of the tour.
The whole world needs help, but you can't start by helping the whole world. You have to start by helping your community and building on what you have, so then you can continue to work outward, because that's how you change the world. You got to start small.
And that's exactly what the people of Ivanhoe are doing. They are starting with the things that they can change in their immediate neighborhood. I'm Nathaniel Bozarth. This tour was created as a part of the Johnson County Library's Race Project KC. The library's Civic Engagement Committee and Tanner Colby's book, Some of My Best Friends Are Black, inspired much of the ongoing work of Race Project KC. The original bus tour was the brainchild of KC Metro teacher and good friend Paul Richardson, who was inspired by the powerful tours led by Eric Stafford and his Kansas City tour company. Check out his tours. This video and the tour on VoiceMap were made possible by support from the Johnson County Library, Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, and the Kansas Humanities Council. It was produced by Brainroot Light and Sound, written by myself and Christopher Cook. The books that we've relied heavily on for this tour can be found in a list on the webpage for this tour. Thanks also to Herman Mahari and the Kansas City Jazz Legacy Project, KCLP, whose music is featured throughout the tour. In a speech author Tanner Colby made in Kansas City in 2017, he reminded us, "The imaginary barriers in Kansas City are only there because we say they are, and we can take them down whenever we choose to." Thanks for journeying with us on the Dividing Lines tour of the history of segregation in Kansas City.